for I will tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed. In a flash, in a twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. For the perishable must clothe itself with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality. When the perishable has been clothed with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality, then the saying that is written will come true. Death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? For the sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God. He gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is never in vain. Recently, probably, I don't remember if it was early last week or toward the end of the week before, while I was in the office, I was at my cubicle, and I don't remember exactly what I was doing, but there was this consistent sound that was coming from across the other side of the office, this consistent hiccuping. And this wonderful person who I adore and who's an amazing minister had this condition where she was consistently hiccuping to the point that it was bothering everybody in the office. And so Ken, in his wisdom and his great spirit-filled self, crept down behind some of the cubicles and came around and startled this individual. And that was the end of the hiccups. Well, studying for this sermon and reading through this text was kind of like Ken startling this minister. This text startled me. And no, it's not that I've never read this text or never looked at this text. Actually, I had preached from a portion of this text earlier. But at this moment, during this time, with this sermon series, I've seen this text anew. I've seen it in a way I had never seen it before. It was completely different. It was outside of the box if there ever was one. And for those of you who know me, I don't really do much for structure and boxes. So for something to be outside the norm for me is natural. But this was beyond even me. And so in this text that I just read, it says not to labor in vain for the Lord. Well, I want us to look at our speech and how we labor in our language. In this series, Christ, the Wisdom of God, we've walked through different avenues focusing on the cross metaphor by Paul and what the cross means for our faith and what it means in the overall picture of God's wisdom. Well, this particular lesson, we're going to look at the cross being vindicated. Vindicated in the sense of being cleared from accusation and being claimed for one's own self. I want us to look through some slides for a minute and to think through the vindication of the accused in these slides, how their language could be used. So our first slide, we have a picture of the Holocaust. What could these Nazi Germans say to justify their actions? What could be said, what could be uttered from their mouth that would say, I could see how they could do that. I could understand. What could be uttered? What could be said? Maybe you're not coming up with anything. Let's try the next one. Let's see if anything can come from this next one. In the top left corner is a 17-year-old boy by the name of Jesse Washington. He was mentally disabled and a farmhand. He was castrated, mutilated, and burned alive. The chief of police and the mayor of the town were both there to witness this. Said nothing, did nothing. What could those who are standing around spectating say to justify what happened? What words would they use to say that this was okay? Well, let's look at the picture below him. This book, 13 Loops, records the last lynching in America. It was in 1981. It was after this lynching that they changed the phrasing from lynching to actually hate crimes. And this story is about Michael Donald, a 19-year-old, who went to the store to pick up on some items for his sister. And on his way home, he was picked up by two Klansmen, taken out to the woods and beat, and then also lynched. What would those individuals say as to the reasons why? Are there any reasons that could support these actions? Is there any justification? Is there any vindication for the accused? In the slide to the right of those is a book by a theologian by the name of James Cone. And in Cone's book, he compares the lynchings in America to the crucifixion of Christ, and how there are symbols and resemblances that are striking. But he doesn't offer a word about what the accused would say. So in this next slide, we have something that we all should remember. I remember the day and the hour. There I was, a freshman in high school in my history class. And they brought in the TV to our room so we could see what was going on. There I am in Wichita, Kansas. And as we had heard them talking and we seen the first building going down, watching the screen, we seen the next plane live fly into the building. And our teacher's back was to the TV and he was talking to us, trying to relay the message, when one of the girls in our class just shrieked and said, "Is that really happening?" And he turned around and he was in shock. But those pictures of the individuals are those who were accused of committing such a heinous act. Though we never got to hear their testimony, is there any way that they could say something that would validate their actions? Is it possible for them to say anything that would cause any of us to have sympathy, empathy, or dare I say, for us to say it was justified? By looking at all of you, I can tell that most of you are thinking, of course not. There's no reason, there's no justification for such actions. There's no way people who commit such crimes, who do such heinous things, could ever be vindicated. Well, I'd like to tell you something. This next slide is blank. That's just because I didn't have a church picture wide enough to put us all on. See, we still get the opportunity to say something. But does our language matter? Does our language allow us to vindicate ourselves from the evil crime that we committed? Is it possible? Well, I think Paul has something to say concerning that. In 1 Corinthians, the first chapter, beginning at verse 17, Paul lays out a portion of his theology concerning the crucifixion moment. And this rich text lays out something that is so amazing, such a mystery to the human understanding, that it can only be counted as the wisdom of God. Verse 17, Paul says, "For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with words of human wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power." And now stay on this text really quickly on verse 17, because we have to break this apart really quickly. In my years of studying biblical languages, the more and I'm more fond of is Greek. And it surprised me that reading through this text, and Don, when I came in your office, this is why I hurried up and came in there to look at it, because this part shocked me as well. But the phrase to preach the gospel, in most cases, when you see the word to preach in the Greek, it's a word, keruso, is usually the word that you get, which usually means to preach or to proclaim. But in this instance, one of the 4 instances in the Pauline letters, Paul uses the word euangelizo. Now, this is a compound word for good, and the word that we get, messenger or angel. So it brings a difference to the text when you see this. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but instead Christ sent me as a messenger of what's good. He sent me as a messenger of good things. We translate this word, the good news, which is where we get the gospel. Paul says that Christ sent me to be a messenger of good news. He says, but I didn't have to come up with my own words for this good news. All I had to do was repeat the message that was given. See, this is important when we began to see what's going to take place in these later verses. Because Paul says, I need you to understand that what I'm giving you is exactly what I got. I didn't add anything. I didn't try to doctor it up. I didn't try to put my own spin on it, my own elegance to it. All I'm doing is giving you the message that was sent by way of me. He says, and I do that lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. In verse 18, he says, for the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise. The intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate. Where is the wise man? Where is the scholar? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made the foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him. I need you to underline this, highlight it, whatever you can do in your text. It says, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. I want us to stop right here. I want us to look at what's really taking place. I want you to see the court scene of this account. See, here I stood before the great judge. I stood before God, with God on the throne, with the gavel in his hand, with the heavenly host as the jury around me, and my prosecutor was the slain lamb. See, there I stood in the midst of the heavenly court. And those heavenly hosts had already come to their conclusion. The jury had the verdict in hand. And they've given it to the great judge. And the prosecutor, when he presented his evidence, all he did was show him his hands and his feet. That's all the evidence he needed. And what was I to say? I didn't do it because I had. He had the holes in his hand and the holes in his feet because of me. So here I stand, knowing my fate. I know there's nothing I can say. There's nothing left to be said. There's nothing left for me to do. I'm guilty as guilty can be. And as the great judge gets ready to declare what the verdict is, the slain lamb comes from behind the table of the prosecutor. He comes over to my side. He stands between me and the judge. And as God executes the judgment, as he slams the gavel down and yells out, "Guilty," the slain lamb says, "I'll take it." And he turns back to me and says, "Just tell my story." He looked at me and said, "Just tell my story." So here I am, set to go free. And Paul says this is what took place. And Paul says to everyone else, this looks like complete foolishness. But to those of us who are saved because we believe in what took place on the cross, it's the most glorious thing ever. Because we realized there was nothing to be said. There was nothing we could say on our own behalf, on our own account that could set us free. We all stood there guilty, as guilty could be. If we were playing the game Clue, we'd have the murder weapon in hand standing next to the body. And Christ says, "Just tell my story." And Paul says that me being able to preach is not anything that I can do. I stand to preach the gospel because I realize that's all that I need to do. I don't have to go around giving people my doctrination. I don't have to go around telling you the tradition of my faith. I just have to give you the crucifixion moment and tell you about Jesus. I don't have to wrap it in a nice, pretty box. I don't have to tell you all the decisions that came from everything else. We don't have to give you the road to make it anywhere else. And if you don't get the foundation point of the crucifixion, then baptism means nothing. Paul says it starts with Jesus, it ends with Jesus, and it's all about Jesus. Had there not been any Jesus, nothing else makes sense. He says that crucifixion moment is the most pivotal moment for our faith. But I want you to think about how often we get into quarrels and battles with religious things and we end up at the cross. We go everywhere else but there. We can complain on instrumental music, women's roles, and everything else, and every time we get political about it. But we miss out on the cross. Because see, when you get to the cross, the ground levels for everyone. Because everybody's guilty at the cross. There is no better, there is no greater, there is no higher. Everybody's equal at the cross. But see, we get so caught up in trying to tell our story ahead of the cross, or we try to interweave our story into the cross, that we make other people feel ashamed about the cross. And we wonder why the gospel message isn't as effective. It's because you keep trying to add other things to it. If you just give them the message as it was, if you tell them who Jesus was and what he did, Paul said everything else will work out the way God intended. But see, we take people from one crucifixion scene to the next and we try to make them bear the cross again. We tell them that they're not worth it, that they have to do all these other hurdles, they have to jump through all these other hoops just for our pleasing. And Jesus says, no, that's not my story. That's not what I died for. That's not what the crucifixion meant for me. And if you got it right, then you'd realize that you're in the same place they are. Regardless of what color you're wrapped in, regardless of what side of the political spectrum you fall on, regardless of your educational background, the like or the lace. He said it doesn't matter, regardless of what you have in the bank or what you don't have in the bank or how negative it might be right now in the bank. He said it doesn't matter. Because everybody's the same at the cross. And Paul says the very fact that God allows us to preach about the story is complete foolishness. God said, I use the accused. to further the message. It was the guilty ones who get to go tell the story. It was those who had no reason to speak again that I'm allowing to tell the crucifixion message. And it says in verse 22, the Jews demand signs and the Greeks look for wisdom. Paul says, but we preach Christ crucified. It's a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. See, going over this text, and as this was coming together and this was coming through my mind, I couldn't help but to see how great and how awesome the Christ is and what he did on the cross. See, for so long, I thought the cross message was just that my sins were forgiven. I thought that was all there was to it. But that's only part of the story. See, it's kind of like when somebody knows they've done wrong and you keep trying to justify what you've done and you keep trying to give more answers and all you're doing is digging yourself deeper and deeper into the hole. And finally, somebody who loves you tells you, just shut up and let it be. You're not going to fix it. You're not going to get any better. See, this is the crucifixion moment. We kept trying to talk our way out of it. We try to rationalize it. And I had a good friend in college, one of my roommates, who would always say, when you're rationalizing, you're doing just that, trying to rationalize your lies. He says, if you have to do that, you're never going to get anywhere. There is no ration for your lies. It's a lie. But see, this is what it is. We're standing before the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. And our guilt is right there. And Christ says, I'll take the guilt for you. I'll take the punishment for you. I'll take the sentencing for you. But just realize that since you get to walk out of here like you didn't do it, just tell my story. Tell the story of me, of what I did. And when you realize that what the sentencing was for you, you can't help but to tell the story. You can't help but to open your mouth and to preach the gospel because you realize what it's done. You can't help but to tell people about the crucifixion moment regardless of who they are because you realize that it should have been your fate. It should have been your verdict against you. See, reading this text helped bring to mind, helped bring to conscience how awesome our God is, how wonderful God's wisdom is. Because in my greatest wisdom, I would have never come up with a plan such as this. I would have never thought of how the innocent could have justified the guilty, and how the language of the guilty could be used to vindicate the moment. See, God said, I used your lips. I used your tongue to not only clear you from the accusation, but I used it to claim you for myself. So he says we're all vindicated. And you're saying, but how did I get vindicated? I didn't do anything to deserve it. You didn't. You're saying, but God, how am I vindicated? Why? And he says, because I love you. That's what grace is for you. But you're saying, God, what kind of love is this? And he says, the love that I show to my people. It's a love that's beyond comprehension. It's a love that spans beyond your own thinking. And he says the Jews tried to get their thinking that there was going to be some great sign. The Greeks thought that they had enough ability to get the wisdom and the knowledge to conquer what I was doing. But he said, I need you to understand it's complete foolishness. This is just radically outside of anything you would ever think to do. And you need to leave it there. just go ahead and say that you believe in the foolishness of God and that his foolishness is greater than my wisdom and that I'm okay with that. See, that's difficult for me, especially. I just have to admit it. I spend my time trying to amass knowledge, being in school. I love learning new things. I'm always intrigued by gaining new knowledge and new wisdom. But at the end of the day, none of it amounts to what God has done. None of it amounts to what God did through Jesus Christ on the cross, and it still baffles me. And it baffles me mainly because I know my own sin. I know how bad I am. And if I didn't know, I have a wife who would let me know. Well, actually, who does let me know. It doesn't take me long to recount what I've done wrong. I can go back a few hours. I'm sure there's something there. And if I think hard enough, I could probably come up with a list of things. But when I think back over a lifetime, there's probably not enough pages in the world. I'm sure I could fill up many hard drives with all the things I've done wrong and all the sins I've committed. But I don't have to worry about them because Christ stands in front of me and took the blame and says that I'm going to vindicate you through this moment. As the judge executed his judgment, he saw that I was guilty. He didn't let me go because I was better than somebody else. He didn't dismiss me from taking the punishment because of who I am. There was nothing I did. He says, but it's because of what Christ did. It's because he got on the cross. But think about how weird it is for us to imagine that it was because of us that we nailed him there. See, I put Christ on the cross. It wasn't the judge, it was me. And so after taking the cross, he also takes the punishment for me. And I walk away free. God, I just don't get it. But church, I think when we begin to live into the gospel message, the true crucifixion story, relationships look completely different. Because we realize that no one is greater or less than anyone else. We won't let the little things divide us because Paul said in the beginning, is Christ divided? And his answer was no. But see, in the Corinthian church, it was divided because they started uttering and muttering and complaining about the little things. As Don talked about last week, those little things started to divide people. See, whether it's instrumental music or women's roles or homosexuality or any of the other things that we find ourselves scattering and running away from church hopping about, at the end of the day, he said it's not worth it. If Christ can pay the price of the cross, then anything else you have to divide yourself isn't worth it. There's nothing that big. There's nothing that great for you to divide over. You're saying, but what about? Doesn't matter. It's not that great. At the end of the day, at the moment of the crucifixion, God said, I brought everybody together. And because I brought everybody together, you have no ability to take anybody else apart. No man has the ability to undo what God brought together. No human being. So I want to challenge us. I want to challenge this community, this body of Christ, to be together. I want us to look squarely at our lives through the lens of the crucifixion and see how we were vindicated. And when you see that you're vindicated, I want you to think about what that means for your relationship with God and your relationship with everyone else. Because what's so amazing about this whole story, for me, when I look back at Genesis 1 and 2, the most odd thing in that whole sequence, as God is creating, as God is putting everything in the world together, his phrase is, and it was good. He continuously says, after creating, it was good. You get to Genesis chapter 2, after creating Adam, he puts Adam in the garden, he gives him the animals, Adam names all the animals, and God says he saw that man was alone, and it wasn't good. Now, I don't know about y'all, but I was thinking, Adam in the garden alone with God, what could be better than that? God said, that's not good. God says you have to have someone else for you. And not necessarily a companion as a wife, but you need relationship beyond just your relationship with God to express how a relationship with God should function. See, this is the reason why it wasn't good for Adam to be alone. Because, see, it's easy to say, I love God, but if you can't love the person next to you, then your loving God is false. And God said, I started that example with Adam. He can't be alone just like you can't do it alone. So I'm going to give you other people, a helpmate. And this is what we have here today. The community, the body of Christ is made up of helpmates. So I'm asking you to be focused on the cross, which the cross says that I put you into relationship one with another. A relationship so deep, so intimate, that it should never be broken. And when you find yourself feeling that I need to break these relationships, that I need to break away and dismantle myself, I hope the cross comes back to mind. And that when you think of the cross, you put yourself right back in there. And we get back to work. Because as Paul said in chapter 15, for your work in the Lord, let it not be in vain. So church, let us not work in vain. Let us not work and at the end of the day stand before the judge and actually be found guilty when we don't have to, because Christ said, I vindicated you and I'll take the blame. So let him take the blame and let us go out and tell his story.